Penelope Nichols stood over the fresh grave, the Montana wind so bitter it felt like it was trying to steal the breath from her lungs. 3 small children were anchors, pulling on her black skirts, their tiny tears freezing solid on their wind-burned cheeks. She couldn't cry. Not anymore. Not here. The tears had all been spent in the 3 days since the mine collapsed. The 3 days since it had swallowed her Thomas whole, leaving her with nothing but his children and his debts. The town was already whispering. "Mama, I'm cold," 5-year-old Eliza said, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. Penelope bent, her own bones aching with the chill, and pulled her daughter's cap down tighter. "Just a little longer, sweet pea." Her voice was a lie, a thin blanket of warmth against a blizzard of despair. 7-year-old James stood stiff and serious, trying to look like the hard-faced men who'd come to pay their respects. 10-year-old Abigail, who knew what forever meant, was crushing her mother's hand. The last of the mourners drifted away like ghosts in the snow. But one remained. Mrs. Holloway, the butcher's wife, came clucking toward them, a casserole dish in her hands. "Such a shame," she said, her voice thick with the kind of sympathy that enjoyed its own sound. "Whatever will you do now, Penny? A woman alone with 3 mouths to feed." "We'll manage," Penelope said, her back as straight as a fence post. Mrs. Holloway's tongue clicked against her teeth. "Well, you know what they say. No one wants a widow with children, especially not 3 of them." She scanned Penelope's face for a crack, for a single tear she could report back to the town. "Perhaps your parents back east." "My parents passed 2 winters ago," Penelope said, the words tasting like dirt. "There's no one." "Oh dear." Mrs. Holloway's eyes lit up with the thrill of it. Fresh tragedy was the town's finest currency. "Well, there's always the laundry, I suppose, though they don't pay much." She gave Penelope's arm a pat that felt more like a shove, then turned away, already whispering to her husband. Penelope didn't let her shoulders slump. Not until they were gone. The mine owner had given her a pittance, barely enough for the pine box Thomas was buried in. The rent on their tiny cabin was due in 2 weeks. Winter was just setting in. And as the first snowflakes began to fall, dusting the raw earth of her husband's grave, Penelope knew they were in trouble. Deep trouble. The walk home was a long, cold silence. The only sound was the crunch of their boots in the snow that was coming faster now, thicker. Penelope's mind was a frantic storm of numbers. How much food was left? What she could get for Thomas's tools? Who in Silver Creek would ever hire a widow with a shadow of 3 small children? The answers were all grim. When they finally reached the cabin, she stoked the fire and watched the children huddle close, their little bodies still trembling. "Mama," Abigail asked, her voice quiet, "are we going to be all right?" Penelope looked into her daughter's eyes, so much like Thomas's, and she couldn't lie. Not to her. "It's going to be difficult," she admitted, "but we will figure it out. Together." That night, after the children were asleep in the one bed they all shared, she sat at the rough-hewn table. She pulled out Thomas's old tobacco tin. She counted the coins inside. $23.42. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. She pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote letters by the flickering lamplight. One to the general store begging for credit. One to the landowner asking for time. And one to Mr. Harrove, the mine owner, demanding what was rightfully owed to her, demanding justice for the husband he'd sent into a death trap. Her tears finally fell then, hot and angry, spotting the paper. But when the sun came up, the tears were gone. And Penelope Nichols had a plan. It wasn't a good plan. It was a desperate one. But it was all she had. 2 days later, she was hanging laundry when a horse kicked up snow in her yard. It was Mr. Jensen, the owner of the general store. His face was a mask of strained politeness. "Mrs. Nichols, he said, taking off his hat. "About your letter. I wish I could help, I truly do. But with the mine slowing for winter," he just shrugged. "I could work," Penelope said, her voice tight, "to pay for what we need. I'm good with figures." Jensen shook his head, looking uncomfortable. "My wife helps. And besides, some of the ladies in town, they might not take kindly to a widow working so close with their husbands." The insult was a slap in the face. "My only concern is feeding my children, Mr. Jensen." Of course, he stammered. "It's just, people talk. Have you thought about, well, one of those mail-order bride services? A woman like yourself, still young, might find a new husband to take on the responsibility." Her cheeks burned with shame and fury. "The responsibility you refer to is my family," she said, her voice like ice. "And they are not for sale." After he scurried away, Penelope leaned against the cold logs of the cabin, fighting for breath. The town wasn't just unhelpful. It was trying to erase her, to package her up and ship her away. That evening, another knock came. This time it was Sheriff Wilson. He held an envelope in his hand. "From Mr. Harrove," he said, not meeting her eyes. "His response to your letter." The sheriff cleared his throat. "He also wanted me to remind you, ma'am, that your husband signed papers. He accepted the risks." Penelope tore open the envelope. Inside was a bank draft for $10. $10 for her husband's life. "And what about the support beams?" she asked, her voice trembling with rage she could barely contain. "The ones my husband told his foreman were rotten? The ones he reported twice?" The sheriff's face hardened. "Now, Mrs. Nichols, those are serious accusations. I understand you're grieving, but making things up won't help you. In fact," he added, and the threat was unmistakable, "it might make folks less inclined to offer any help at all." He left her standing there in the doorway, the $10 insult clutched in her hand. She understood now. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a conspiracy. The whole town was lined up against her, and she had no idea why. That night, after the children slept, she pulled an old trunk from under the bed. Inside were the last things of value she owned. Thomas's pocket watch, her mother's silver hairbrush, things she'd sworn she'd never part with. But pride couldn't feed her children. The next morning, she bundled the little ones up and walked them into town. The pawn shop was a grimy little place wedged between the saloon and the blacksmith. Mr. Clarkson, the owner, barely glanced at her treasures. He offered her a fraction of what they were worth. When she tried to argue, he just sneered. "Times are tight, Mrs. Nichols. I'm doing you a favor. Most folks wouldn't buy from a widow who's like to skip town any day now." She took the money. Each coin felt like a stone in her pocket, dragging her down. Next was the bank. It was even worse. "I'm afraid your husband took a loan, Mrs. Nichols," the bank manager said, his sympathy as thin as ice. "Against his future earnings. With the compensation from the mine, you still owe the bank $12.18. Her blood ran cold. They didn't just have no money. They were in debt to the very people who had killed her husband. This wasn't just bad luck. Someone was trying to crush her, to drive her out. As they walked home, the alteration work she'd picked up from the dressmaker feeling flimsy and useless under her arm, the snow began to fall again. She was so lost in her spiraling thoughts, she didn't see the horseman until he was almost upon them. He was a tall man on a big chestnut horse, his face shadowed by his hat. He wasn't a miner. His clothes were worn, but they were good quality. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Storm's coming in fast. You and the little ones need a ride?" Penelope froze. A stranger. In a town where everyone had turned against her, a stranger was the most dangerous thing of all. "We're fine," she said, pulling the children closer. "It's no imposition," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "I'm headed out to the Rocking V Ranch. Your place is on my way." He knew where she lived. The fear in her gut tightened into a cold knot. "You know where we live?" she asked, her voice sharp. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone knows the Nichols place. Last cabin before the creek. I was sorry to hear about your husband. Thomas was a good man." He said Thomas's name like he knew him, like a friend. But Penelope had never seen this man in her life. "You knew my husband?" "Met him once," the man said smoothly. "He helped me out of a tight spot last spring. Wagon broke an axle near the mine." It could be true, or it could be a lie designed to make her lower her guard, but the children were shivering. The sky was turning a bruised, ugly purple. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," he said. "Riker Vance." He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion. He was taller than she'd thought, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of whiskey. He lifted James and Eliza onto his horse as if they weighed nothing. He had a second horse, a pack horse, for her and Abigail. The ride was tense and quiet. He tried to make small talk, but Penelope answered in clipped, short sentences. Something was wrong about this. Terribly wrong. When they reached her cabin, he didn't just leave. He dismounted and pulled a package from his saddlebags. "Baker had extra honey cakes," he said, holding it out to her. "Thought the kids might like them." It was too much, too kind. People in Silver Creek weren't kind, not to her. Before she could properly refuse, he was back on his horse. "If you need anything," he called out, his voice carrying over the rising wind. "The rocking V is just up the North Trail. Anyone can point the way." Then he was gone, disappearing into the swirling snow. The children rushed inside, thrilled with the unexpected sweets. But Penelope stood on the porch, the package heavy in her hand, and watched him go. Riker Vance wasn't a kind stranger. She was sure of it. He was something else, and his sudden appearance, on this day of all days, felt less like a rescue and more like a warning. That night, the storm hit like a fist. The wind screamed around the little cabin, and snow piled up in monstrous drifts. For 3 days, they were trapped. For 3 days, Penelope sat by the fire, mending clothes and watching their food supply dwindle, her mind racing. Who was Riker Vance? Why had he lied about knowing Thomas? She was sure he had. Thomas would have mentioned helping a rancher. He would have mentioned a man like Vance. When the storm finally broke, their woodpile was nearly gone. She had to go out. "James, you're in charge," she told her son. "Don't open the door for anyone." The snow was waist-deep in places. The woods were cold and silent. Every snap of a twig made her jump. It took her an hour of back-breaking work to half-fill her sack with frozen, wet branches. Her strength was failing. The cold was a physical pain, deep in her bones. She reached for one last branch. Her foot slipped on ice she hadn't seen, and a searing, white-hot agony shot up her leg. She crumpled into the snow, her ankle screaming. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the pain. She was a mile from home. Her children were alone. If she couldn't walk, they were all doomed. Gritting her teeth, she used a thick branch to haul herself up. The journey back was a nightmare. Every step was a fresh wave of torture. She was still hundreds of yards from the cabin, stumbling, crying, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. It was him, Riker Vance. He was leading a small cart loaded with perfectly split dry logs. He saw her, and his face was a thundercloud. "Mrs. Nichols? What in God's name are you doing?" He was off his horse in a second, striding toward her. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she gasped. But the lie was pathetic. His eyes took in her sprained ankle, her soaked clothes, her miserable sack of wet twigs. And then, before she could protest, he swept her up into his arms. "Mr. Vance, this is highly inappropriate." "What's inappropriate is you trying to get yourself killed," he said, his voice a low growl. He carried her as if she were a child and deposited her on the bench of his cart. He'd been on his way to her cabin, with a cart full of wood. It wasn't a coincidence. It was impossible. He must have been watching her, waiting for her to fail. When they reached the cabin, he carried her inside, settling her by the fire. He knelt and, ignoring her protests, gently removed her boot to examine her swollen ankle. His hands were surprisingly gentle. "It's a bad sprain," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "You need to stay off it for a few days." "That's impossible." "You won't be much use to your children if you can't walk at all," he said. The logic was cold, inescapable. Then he turned to her children, his voice softening. He sent Abigail for cold water. He enlisted James to help him stack the firewood, praising the boy's strength. He charmed little Eliza with stories of spotted horses. He was dismantling her family's defenses, one by one. Then he turned back to her, his expression serious. "Mrs. Nichols, I was hoping to make you a proposition." Penelope's entire body went rigid. "My housekeeper left last month," he said, his eyes holding hers. "I need someone to cook, clean, run the house. I'm offering you a job, room and board for you and the children, and wages." It was a lifeline. It was a perfect, elegant solution to all her problems, and that's what made it so terrifying. It was a trap. The ranch house was huge, 5 bedrooms, he'd said, a schoolhouse for the children, all for him, alone. It was too good to be true. "It's a fair exchange," he said, as if reading her mind. "I need help. You need a safe place for your family." She looked at her throbbing ankle, at her children's hopeful faces, already won over by this charming, dangerous man. She had no choice, and he knew it. "I'll have your answer tomorrow," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll stop by to check on that ankle," he said, his eyes gleaming with a victory she couldn't yet understand. "And to hear your decision." After he left, the children exploded with excitement. A real ranch, horses. But Abigail, her wise, old soul Abigail, voiced the question that was screaming in Penelope's own mind. "Mama," she whispered, "do you think it's safe? We don't know him." "No, sweet girl," Penelope said, pulling her daughter close. "We don't." That night, Penelope lay awake, her mind a battlefield of fear and logic. Staying here meant starvation, or freezing, or being crushed by the forces aligned against her in town. Going with Riker Vance meant walking willingly into the den of a lion. A handsome, smiling lion who had appeared out of nowhere and knew all her weaknesses. It was a choice between a fast death and a slow one. When he arrived the next afternoon, she was packed. "We accept your offer, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice formal. "This is employment, not charity. I will earn my keep." "I'd expect nothing less," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. The Rocking V Ranch was nestled in a valley, miles from town, miles from any other living soul. The main house was a fortress of logs and stone, with smoke curling from its chimney like a warning. As they approached, a young man, barely 17, came out of the barn. "That's Charlie, my foreman," Riker said. Charlie didn't smile. He watched them with hard, suspicious eyes, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. He helped with their meager belongings, but his gaze never left Penelope. This was no safe haven. This was a prison. The house was beautiful inside, spacious and warm, filled with fine furniture and books. Riker showed them to 3 connecting rooms upstairs. "My room is at the other end of the hall," he said. He was isolating them, separating them from the world and from him. He offered her a wage that was more than any man in the mines made. It was an absurd amount of money. He wasn't paying for a housekeeper. He was buying a hostage. That night, after a silent, tense dinner, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her gut. "Mr. Vance, why are you doing this? Truly." He looked at her across the long oak table, his whiskey-colored eyes unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "When my mother died," he began, his voice low and practiced. "My father was left alone to raise me and my brother Daniel. The town told him to send us away, to get a new wife. But he refused. He kept us together. It was a good story, a perfect story, crafted to sound just like her own. When I heard about your situation," he continued, "it reminded me of his. I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Nichols. I'm offering an opportunity." He was lying. She could feel it. Every word was a carefully chosen weapon designed to disarm her. The days that followed were a strange dream. On the surface, it was peaceful. The children were happy. They had warm beds and full bellies. Riker was a perfect gentleman, patient and kind with the children, respectful and distant with her. But the foreman, Charlie, was always watching, and the house held secrets. One afternoon, while Riker was out on the range, Penelope began a thorough cleaning of the main floor. She was dusting the books in the library when her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard behind a heavy armchair. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Prying it open, she found a small, locked metal box. It was the kind of box a person used to keep things hidden. Things they didn't want found. She managed to pick the cheap lock with a hairpin. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was not jewelry or money. It was a photograph. A daguerreotype of a handsome young man with Riker's eyes and an easy smile. And behind the photograph was a stack of letters. They were love letters, passionate, secret letters. And they were signed, "All My Love, Thomas." Penelope's world tilted on its axis. The letters weren't addressed to her. They were addressed to Mr. Daniel Vance, Riker's brother. Her Thomas, her good, honest Thomas, had been in love with Riker Vance's brother. This wasn't just a secret. In a town like Silver Creek in 1876, this was a death sentence. Suddenly, everything made a horrible kind of sense. Riker wasn't lying when he said he was helping Thomas's family. He was helping his brother's family. But then she found the last letter. It was different. It was frantic, written in a scrawled, desperate hand. "Daniel, Harrove knows. He found out about us. He's threatening to expose me, to ruin me. But it's worse than that. He's cutting corners at the mine. The main support beams in Shaft 4 are rotten. I told him, I showed him, but he won't listen. He says it's cheaper to pay off a few widows than to shut down for repairs. He's going to kill men, Daniel. I have the proof. The ledger's showing what he paid for the cheap lumber. I have to get it to you. Meet me. Don't tell Riker. Harrove is watching him too. He suspects you both." Penelope's blood ran cold. The mine collapse wasn't an accident. It was murder. And Riker wasn't her captor. He was her protector. He'd been trying to solve his own brother's disappearance while honoring a promise to the man his brother had loved. Daniel Vance wasn't in Boston. He was likely at the bottom of a ravine somewhere, silenced by Harrove, and Riker had brought her here not to trap her, but to hide her, to keep her safe from the man who had killed her husband. Just as this realization crashed down on her, she heard the sound of approaching horses. A lot of them. She ran to the window. It was Sheriff Wilson, and with him, riding at the front, was Mr. Harrove, the mine owner. And they had at least a dozen men with them, all armed with rifles. They hadn't come for a friendly visit. They'd found her. "Penelope!" Riker's voice boomed from the doorway. He'd come in the back way, his face pale, a rifle in his hand. "Get the children. Get them to the cellar. Now." Charlie, the foreman, was right behind him, his own rifle at the ready. His suspicious glares hadn't been for her. They'd been for the danger he knew was coming for her. "They know you're here," Riker said, his voice grim as he barred the heavy front door. "They think you have the ledgers." "I do," Penelope whispered, clutching the metal box to her chest. "Thomas wrote about it. He had proof." Riker's eyes widened. He and Daniel had been searching for that proof for months. Harrove hadn't just murdered Thomas. He'd murdered Riker's brother, too. This was never just about a mine collapse. It was about wiping out anyone who knew his secrets. "Well, Mrs. Vance," Harrove's voice called from outside, dripping with menace. "I know you're in there. Send out the woman and children, and we'll let you live." Riker looked at Penelope, his face set like granite. "He's lying." Of course he was. They were loose ends. All of them. The first shot shattered a window, sending glass spraying across the floor. The siege had begun. The next few hours were a blur of terror. Gunshots echoed through the house. Wood splintered near Penelope's head as she huddled with her children in the cold, dark root cellar. Abigail was a rock, holding a terrified Eliza, while James clutched an old, rusted shovel like a weapon, his face a mask of fierce determination. Upstairs, she could hear Riker and Charlie shouting, the crack of their rifles answering the volley from outside. The house was a fortress, built to withstand attacks. But they were only 2 men against a dozen. It was only a matter of time. Down in the suffocating darkness, Penelope's mind raced. The letters proved Harrove's motive. But where were the ledgers, the actual proof Thomas had died for? She thought back to that last morning. Thomas getting ready for work. Kissing her goodbye. He'd been quiet, his face tight with worry. He'd been fiddling with something, his pocket watch. He'd taken it from the mantelpiece, opened it, and closed it again with a sharp click before slipping it into his vest. The watch. The one she'd pawned. The one Clarkson had sneered at her for selling. But then a memory surfaced. After they had moved to the ranch, Riker had placed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on her dresser one night. "I took the liberty of buying these back for you," he'd said gruffly. "A man's things should stay with his family." Inside had been her mother's hairbrush and Thomas's watch. It was upstairs, in her jewelry box. She had to get to it. "Stay here," she whispered to Abigail. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me or Riker." Abigail's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded. Penelope slipped out of the cellar, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She crept up the back stairs, staying low, the sounds of the gunfight growing louder. Her room was at the front of the house, the most dangerous place to be. A bullet ripped through the wall next to her head, showering her with plaster. She screamed, scrambling the rest of the way on her hands and knees. She found the jewelry box, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open it. There was the watch. She fumbled with the back casing. Her fingernail broke, but she didn't care. It popped open, and there, folded into a tiny, tight square, was a thin piece of paper. It wasn't the ledgers. It was something far better. It was a sworn, signed confession from the mine foreman, the one her husband had reported the rotten beams to. It detailed every bribe, every warning Harrove had ignored, every dollar he'd saved by putting men's lives at risk. Thomas had convinced the man to write it down, likely with a promise to protect him, a promise Thomas had died trying to keep. This was it, the smoking gun. Just as she clutched it in her hand, the shooting from outside stopped. An eerie silence fell over the house. Then she heard Harrove's voice, closer this time. "Vance, we've got your foreman. We'll trade you. Him for the woman." Penelope's blood froze. They had Charlie. She crept to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains. They had him on his knees in the snow, a gun to his head. Riker's voice, tight with fury, came from the living room below. "Let him go, Harrove." "The woman!" Harrove screamed back. "Or he dies right here." Penelope looked at the confession in her hand. She looked at the boy in the snow. She had a choice to make. She ran downstairs, ignoring Riker's frantic shout. She stood in the bullet-riddled doorway. "Let him go," she called, her voice shaking but clear. "You want the proof? I have it." Harrove's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Throw it out here." "Let the boy go first," Penelope countered. "Let him get inside. Then I'll give it to you." Harrove hesitated, then shoved Charlie toward the house. The boy scrambled inside, bleeding from a cut on his head, but alive. "Now, the proof," Harrove demanded. Penelope held up the confession. She took a step onto the porch, and in that split second, everything happened at once. Riker let out a roar from the window above, and his rifle cracked. One of Harrove's men crumpled to the ground. From the barn, 2 more shots rang out. Ranch hands Riker must have sent for help when he first saw them coming. Harrove, realizing he'd been tricked, raised his own pistol, not at Riker, but at Penelope. She saw the flash, heard the deafening boom, and braced for the impact. But it never came. Riker had thrown himself off the porch, tackling her to the ground, shielding her with his own body as the bullet whizzed over their heads. The fight was short and brutal. Cornered and outmaneuvered, Harrove's men threw down their guns. Harrove and the sheriff, seeing it was over, tried to make a run for it. They didn't get far. When the dust settled, the 2 men who had terrorized Penelope and murdered her husband were on their knees in the snow, their hands bound behind their backs, their faces masks of disbelief and hatred. Justice had come to the Rocking V. The wedding was in the spring, when wildflowers painted the valley in brilliant color. It was a small affair, just friends and neighbors, the people who had stood by them. James, solemn and proud, carried the rings. Abigail stood beside her mother, and Eliza threw flower petals with wild abandon. The whispers in Silver Creek had finally died, replaced by an awed respect for the woman who had faced down a murderer and the quiet rancher who had protected her. One evening, not long after, James came to them as they sat on the porch of the main house. "Since you're married to Mama now," he asked, shuffling his feet, "does that mean we can call you Papa?" Riker knelt, his voice thick with emotion. "I would be honored," he said. "I'm not trying to replace your father, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserve." A year later, Penelope stood on the porch of a new house, a beautiful home Riker had built for them on a gentle rise overlooking the valley. She held a new baby in her arms, Daniel Thomas Vance, named for the brothers they had both lost and now honored. She watched as Riker taught James how to rope a practice dummy, as Abigail sketched the mountains in the journal he'd given her, as Eliza ran laughing through the yard, her future as wide and bright as the Montana sky. They had told her she was a burden. They had told her no one would want a widow with 3 children. They had told her she was worthless without a man to provide for her. They had all been wrong. Love, she had learned, wasn't about finding someone to solve your problems. It was about finding someone who would stand with you while you solved them yourself. The cowboy hadn't saved the widow. He had stood beside her while she saved herself. And in the process, they had built a family, stronger than any fortress, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of winters, a new spring is always waiting. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of unbelievable twists and ultimate justice, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single episode.